Eli Johnson adjusted the strap of his worn backpack as he stepped onto the plane. The air inside was a peculiar mix of recycled oxygen and the faint scent of coffee brewing in the galley. It was nothing like the open workshop back home, where the tang of grease and metal clung to the air and felt, somehow, more honest. He moved quietly, his eyes scanning the rows of seats for his assigned spot, careful not to bump into anyone. Seat 17C. A middle seat. Not ideal, but he wasn't one to complain. This flight wasn't about comfort, it was about urgency. His mother's doctor had called just 2 days ago, saying the time was running out. Now, after scraping together his savings and enduring the odd, knowing stares of TSA agents, he was here. It had taken him nearly 20 years to save enough for a trip like this, but fate had dictated its timing. Eli slid into his seat, nodding politely at the passengers flanking him. On his right, a teenage boy buried his face in a gaming console, oblivious to his surroundings. To his left, a middle-aged woman glanced up briefly from her tablet. She offered a curt nod before returning her attention to the glowing screen. For a moment, Eli allowed himself to relax, folding his hands over his lap. He wasn't used to stillness. His days were spent fixing engines, solving problems, keeping things running. But now, the quiet allowed unwelcome thoughts to creep in. He glanced at his hands, calloused and dark against the pale beige of the armrest. It started subtly. The woman beside him shifted in her seat, crossing her legs away from him. Then came a quiet sniff, almost imperceptible. Eli caught it, but said nothing. He wasn't new to this. It wasn't the first time someone had shrunk away from him in public, and it wouldn't be the last. A few minutes passed. The woman's movements grew sharper, more deliberate. She pressed the call button above her head and leaned into the aisle as a flight attendant approached. "Excuse me," the woman said, her voice low but insistent. "There's a smell coming from this area. It's quite strong, and it's making me uncomfortable." The attendant, a young man with a polished uniform and a tired smile, blinked as if trying to process the complaint. His gaze flickered to Eli, then back to the woman. "I see," the attendant said carefully. Eli felt the weight of their scrutiny, even as they avoided looking directly at him. He sat still, his shoulders tightening. The boy beside him paused his game and glanced up, curiosity flickering across his face. Around them, other passengers stirred. It didn't take long for whispers to ripple through the rows. The flight attendant returned after a brief consultation with a colleague. "Sir," he began, his voice polite but firm, "would you mind moving to another seat? There's an open row near the back of the plane. It might be more comfortable for everyone." Eli looked up at the attendant, then at the woman, who was now staring straight ahead, her lips pressed into a thin line. He could feel the eyes of the cabin on him, expectant and silent. His chest tightened, but his expression remained neutral. He had learned long ago that showing anger only gave people a reason to justify their assumptions. "Sure," Eli said finally, his voice calm, almost detached. He rose from his seat, his movements deliberate, and grabbed his bag from under the chair. As he walked down the aisle, the murmurs swelled behind him like a low tide. At the back of the plane, he slid into the new seat and stared out the window. The runway stretched endlessly, a ribbon of asphalt against the gray sky. He thought of his mother and her small garden, of her hands planting seeds in soil as rich and dark as his own skin. She would have told him to keep his head up, to let the small things roll off his back. But here, in the artificial hum of the plane, that advice felt heavy and distant. Eli sighed, adjusting his position as the captain's voice came over the intercom. The plane shuddered to life, its engines roaring with the promise of ascent. He closed his eyes, hoping the hours ahead would pass quickly. Above him, the woman in 17B returned to her tablet, her fingers scrolling across the screen. She didn't look back, and in the quiet between takeoff and the first service call, the tension of what had just transpired hung heavy, unspoken but unmistakable, like a cloud that neither words nor apologies could dispel. Eli sat at the back of the plane, the faint hum of the engines filling the cabin with an almost soothing monotony. The rows ahead of him seemed distant, like a world he was no longer part of. He gazed out the small oval window, watching the ground disappear beneath the clouds, his thoughts heavy and unspoken. The air around him felt different now. There was a tension, subtle but present, that wasn't there when he first boarded. A few passengers turned their heads occasionally, as if to confirm where he had gone, but most avoided his gaze. The shuffle of footsteps and quiet conversation seemed louder in the aftermath of his relocation, yet no one said anything directly. At the front of the plane, Charlotte Price sat stiffly in her seat, her hands gripping the tablet in her lap. She hadn't returned to her work since Eli had been moved. Instead, she stared blankly at the screen, her mind elsewhere. The discomfort she had felt earlier, the smell that had seemed unbearable, had vanished. And yet, her chest felt tight, weighed down by something she couldn't name. Charlotte had always considered herself a fair person, someone who treated others equally. She prided herself on her work ethic, her attention to detail, her ability to navigate difficult situations. But now, sitting here, she felt a strange unease creeping over her. The man she had complained about, the one she had barely looked at, hadn't argued, hadn't raised his voice. He had simply gotten up and moved. That calm compliance gnawed at her, leaving her with questions she didn't want to answer. A few rows away, a young girl tugged on her mother's sleeve. "Why did the man have to move?" she asked, her voice carrying in the quiet cabin. "Sure," her mother whispered, glancing around nervously. "It's nothing, sweetheart. Just sit still." "But he wasn't doing anything wrong," the girl insisted, her voice tinged with confusion. Charlotte heard the exchange and felt a flush of heat rise to her cheeks. She shifted uncomfortably in her seat, adjusting the scarf around her neck. The child's words lingered in the air, as innocent as they were damning. Further back, Eli closed his eyes, leaning his head against the window. The vibration of the plane was a steady rhythm, a distraction from the weight in his chest. He thought of his mother's voice, soft and steady, urging him to rise above moments like these. But even her wisdom couldn't fully shield him from the sting of being seen as less than, as other. Dr. Ehrening, seated a few rows ahead, had watched the entire scene unfold earlier. He hadn't spoken up, unsure of how to intervene without making things worse. Now, as he adjusted his glasses and flipped through the in-flight magazine, his mind replayed the events. He had seen this before, different faces, different settings, but the same undertone. It was the quiet kind of prejudice, the kind that didn't shout or scream but lingered in body language and unspoken judgments. As the beverage cart rolled down the aisle, the flight attendant from earlier approached Eli's row. Her smile was practiced, professional, but her eyes betrayed a hint of awkwardness. "Can I get you something to drink, sir?" she asked, her voice slightly louder than necessary, as if trying to overcompensate. "Water's fine," Eli replied without looking up. The exchange was brief, uneventful, yet it carried the weight of everything that had happened. The attendant moved on quickly, relieved to escape the tension she had helped create. Charlotte stole a glance over her shoulder, catching a glimpse of Eli as he sipped his water. He looked calm, almost serene, but she couldn't shake the feeling that there was more beneath the surface. Her mind drifted back to her own life, to the moments that had shaped her. The memories she kept buried rose unbidden, a husband who had once belittled her with cutting remarks, who had made her question her worth with something as small as a wrinkled shirt or a misplaced item. Over time, those moments had left scars, invisible but ever-present. She told herself that her reaction to Eli wasn't personal, that it was instinctive, unavoidable. But now, sitting here, she wondered if that was true. Had she seen him, really seen him, or just what she wanted to see? The plane hit a pocket of turbulence, jolting the passengers slightly. A collective murmur rose and fell, and for a moment, the tension shifted to something universal. Eli steadied his hand on the armrest, his gaze flickering toward the aisle. Charlotte closed her eyes and took a deep breath. When the plane leveled again, the cabin settled into an uneasy calm. But the fractures in the air, the subtle cracks in the fabric of politeness and civility, remained. They were unspoken, ignored by most, but they lingered, waiting to be acknowledged. As the flight continued, so did the silence between the rows. Each passenger carried their own thoughts, their own interpretations of what had unfolded. And yet, beneath the surface, something had shifted. For Charlotte, for Eli, and perhaps for the others, the journey ahead was no longer just about miles traveled. It had become something deeper, a quiet reckoning that couldn't be avoided. The cabin lights dimmed slightly as the plane entered its cruising altitude. Eli sat motionless in his seat, staring out at the endless stretch of clouds. The distant horizon, painted with hues of gold and gray, felt unreachable, like a place where the weight of the world might finally lift. Yet here, thousands of feet above the ground, the heaviness in his chest remained. Around him, the other passengers settled into their routines. The rhythmic rustle of pages turning in books, the low hum of a whispered conversation, the occasional clink of ice in a plastic cup, it was all part of the fragile peace that followed the earlier tension. But even in that stillness, Eli felt the unspoken truth hanging in the air. The silence wasn't neutral. It carried the echoes of what had been left unsaid. Charlotte sat stiffly in her seat, her gaze fixed on the seat back in front of her. She hadn't touched her tablet in some time. Instead, she replayed the moment Eli had moved, his calm acceptance of what shouldn't have been asked of him. It gnawed at her, the quiet dignity with which he had walked away. She told herself she'd done what anyone else would have done, what she had to do. But the reasoning sounded hollow now. The plane shuddered suddenly, a sharp dip that pulled everyone from their thoughts. A few gasps rippled through the cabin as the seatbelt sign dinged on. The turbulence wasn't severe, but it was enough to stir unease. Charlotte gripped the armrests, her heart skipping a beat. The captain's voice came over the intercom, steady and calm. "Ladies and gentlemen, we're experiencing a bit of rough air. Please remain seated with your seatbelts fastened. We'll get through this shortly." As the turbulence subsided, a commotion broke out a few rows ahead of Charlotte. A man in his 70s, seated by the window, slumped forward suddenly. His wife, seated beside him, let out a panicked cry. "Help!" she shouted, her voice trembling. "Something's wrong with him." The flight attendant hurried down the aisle, her calm professionalism faltering under the weight of the moment. "Sir? Sir, can you hear me?" she said, shaking the man gently.
He didn't respond.
His breathing was shallow, his face pale. "Is there a doctor on board?" she called, her voice carrying over the low murmurs of alarm spreading through the cabin. Dr. Aaroning rose quickly from his seat, moving toward the commotion. "I'm a physician," he said, his voice steady. "Let me take a look." Eli turned in his seat, watching the scene unfold. For a moment, he hesitated, unsure if his help would be welcomed or even noticed. But something pushed him to act. Rising from his seat, he made his way toward the crowd gathering around the man. "I can help," Eli said quietly, his voice firm but not intrusive. "I'm not a doctor, but I've got experience with emergencies. Let me know what you need." Dr. Ng glanced at him, then nodded. "Good. Help me move him into a better position. We need to check his airway." Eli knelt beside the unconscious man, carefully assisting as they tilted his head back and loosened his collar. He worked efficiently, his movements deliberate and steady. The tension in the cabin shifted, passengers watching with a mix of fear and curiosity. Charlotte sat frozen, her heart racing. She recognized Eli immediately, his calm demeanor so different from her assumptions earlier. She wanted to look away, but she couldn't. There was something disarming about the way he moved, how he worked without hesitation or resentment, even after everything that had happened. Minutes felt like hours, but under Dr. Ng's guidance, the man began to show signs of improvement. His breathing steadied, and his eyes fluttered open. A collective sigh of relief swept through the cabin. The flight attendant thanked both Dr. Ng and Eli profusely, her earlier awkwardness replaced by genuine gratitude. As Eli stood, wiping his hands on his jeans, a smattering of applause broke out among the passengers. It was hesitant at first, then grew louder. He glanced around, surprised by the reaction, then offered a small nod before retreating to his seat. Charlotte felt the weight of her earlier actions pressing down on her. She had been so quick to judge, so eager to push him away. Now, watching him return to his seat quietly, without seeking recognition or praise, she felt a deep sense of shame. Her hands trembled slightly as she adjusted the scarf around her neck, a gesture she repeated when she didn't know what else to do. Eli sat back down, his gaze returning to the clouds outside. The applause had faded, and the cabin was calm once more, but he felt no satisfaction in the moment. It wasn't about proving anyone wrong. He had done what needed to be done, nothing more. The sky outside remained unchanged, vast and indifferent. Charlotte turned her head slightly, stealing another glance at him. For the first time, she saw more than a stranger. She saw a man who carried himself with quiet strength, who had faced prejudice without letting it define him. And in that moment, she felt something shift within her, something she couldn't yet name but knew she couldn't ignore. The flight descended through layers of gray clouds, the horizon shifting from endless sky to patches of land below. The cabin hummed with the quiet anticipation of arrival, passengers preparing to disembark and return to the routines of their lives. For Eli, the end of the flight carried a heavier weight. Home awaited him, not just his mother, but everything he had left behind. He sat silently, gazing out the window. The events of the past hours replayed in his mind, each moment layered with unspoken tension. The applause, the murmured words of gratitude, none of it erased the sting of what had come before. Yet he didn't dwell on it. He had learned long ago that the world was full of contradictions, kindness and cruelty often existing side by side. Charlotte shifted in her seat, glancing at him from across the cabin. She hadn't spoken to him, not directly, though she'd thought of little else since the turbulence had passed. His quiet resolve, his willingness to help without hesitation, it had unraveled something in her, left her grappling with the weight of her assumptions. As the plane touched down, the slight jolt pulling everyone back to the present, Charlotte knew she couldn't leave without addressing the man she had wronged. She waited until the plane slowed to a crawl, the seatbelt sign dinging off, before standing and making her way toward the back of the cabin. Eli looked up as she approached, his expression unreadable. She hesitated for a moment, unsure of how to begin, then spoke softly. "Excuse me," she said, her voice quieter than she intended. "I just wanted to say I'm sorry." Eli tilted his head slightly, studying her face. She continued, her words tumbling out. "I was wrong," she said, her hands clasped tightly in front of her. "I judged you without knowing anything about you, and she paused, taking a shaky breath. "I'm ashamed of how I acted. You didn't deserve that." For a moment, the cabin noise seemed to fade, the chatter of passengers retrieving bags and adjusting coats becoming a distant hum. Eli held her gaze, his own expression softening. "Thank you," he said simply. His voice was calm, measured, but there was a warmth in it that surprised her. Charlotte nodded, unsure of what else to say. She glanced at the other passengers, some of whom were watching the exchange with quiet curiosity. Then, with a faint smile, she returned to her seat to gather her belongings. As Eli stepped off the plane, the cool air of the jet bridge washing over him, he felt lighter somehow. The apology hadn't erased the experience, but it had given him something to hold on to, a reminder that even small acts of acknowledgement could matter. In the terminal, Charlotte watched him disappear into the crowd. She didn't expect forgiveness, not fully, but she felt a sense of resolve. This was a beginning, not an end. She had work to do within herself and in the world around her. Eli walked through the bustling airport, his thoughts returning to the reason for his journey. His mother's face, her laugh, the warmth of her embrace, they were what mattered now. Yet, as he moved toward the exit, he carried with him something unexpected, a sense of quiet victory, not over the world, but over the small part of it that had tried to diminish him. Above, planes ascended into the sky, their paths crossing briefly before disappearing into the horizon. Like the passengers within them, they carried stories, some of misunderstanding, others of redemption, all of them incomplete. And as Eli stepped outside, the sun breaking through the clouds, he felt a sliver of hope for the ones yet to be written.